everybody for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Blodgett and I'm the webinar officer for IWRA. And on behalf of the association, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar with the topic being Reshaping the Nile, Opportunities and Implications of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam for Water Security and Peace. Thanks again for joining us today. For those of you who are new to IWRA, our association is an international network of researchers and practitioners who are working on a range of water resources issues. It provides a global knowledge-based platform for students, for researchers, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are concerned with our world's water resources. At the end of our webinar today, I'll be pleased to share more information of how you can join our association. Given the theme of this year's World Water Day, Water and Peace, which is taking place on Friday, our webinar today will specifically focus on the topic of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam for water security and peace. Today's topics will specifically include: one, how countries involved and impacted by the GERD and its reservoirs will plan and prepare for future drought, and two, how a regional energy trade could impact negotiations over the management of the Nile. Now, before we jump into the webinar, just let me briefly explain what to expect and how our time will go. We'll start by an introduction by an IWRA representative, followed by presentations from our four esteemed colleagues. Our moderator today will be Kevin Wheeler from the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. And at the end of our webinar, we'll have a time for a Q&A section at the end. One note is to please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box specifically. We'll make sure we'll address them there. All other comments can be noted in the chat, but please make sure your comments go into the Q&A section. And please make sure that your questions are relevant for the topic, and only the ones with specific questioning and appropriate for the conversation will be addressed. With that in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over to Marina-Stephan, who is IWRA's Deputy Editor-in-Chief for Water International. Raya, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being for us today. It is my pleasure to open this webinar on behalf of IWRA and to give you some introductory words. Water and peace are closely linked. Water enhances public health and prosperity, food and energy systems, economic development, and environmental integrity, creating stability and peace and preventing tensions. When water is scarce or polluted, or when people have unequal or no access to water, tensions can rise between communities and countries in the case of transboundary water resources. In our current world, water is under severe crisis and pressure due to population growth, socioeconomic turbulences, and climate change impacts, posing threats to livelihoods, ecosystems, and security. Despite the SDGs and the effort to reach the goals, specifically Goal 6 related to clean water and sanitation, lack of access to clean and safe water is still a major issue in some countries, which can lead to social unrest and internal migrations. In the case of transboundary waters, the lack of cooperation can pose risks to the quality and quantity of water supplies and therefore threaten social and international stability. Water often plays a role in conflicts or tensions either between the different water users or provinces or states when its quantity or quality decreases. It can also be used as a weapon during an armed conflict, as we are witnessing now in the case of the attack on the Gaza Strip, where more than 2 million civilians have been deprived from drinking water since more than 5 months now, against all the rules of international humanitarian law, which protect the access to water to civilians, and against the recognized human right to water. Water can also be a casualty in times of conflicts, as is also the case in the Gaza Strip, where the infrastructures have been destroyed, but also in other conflicts, such as in Ukraine with the recent destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, I invite you to read a viewpoint recently published in our journal, Water International. Water, nevertheless, can be a tool for peace within and between countries. It can be a stabilizing force and a catalyst for sustainable development, as it is intrinsic to every aspect of life. Cooperation must be created at the local and national level between the different water uses in an integrated and participatory approach, and also at the transboundary level between countries. Water cooperation creates a positive ripple effect. Working together on water across borders and sectors helps enhancing food security, sustaining healthy livelihoods and ecosystems, building resilience to climate change, and fostering regional integration and peace. In its quality of an international association offering a global platform for improving the understanding and knowledge of water resources issues, IWRA contributes to the debate on water and peace through its congresses, but also other activities such as master classes. For example, we held a master class on water diplomacy, or its contribution to international events as last year's UN Conference on Water, or previously the Groundwater Summit. With its flagship journal, Water International, IWRA offers another forum where policy-relevant articles can be published, aiming at communicating in-depth knowledge and positions to a multidisciplinary and international community, as well as debates and exchanges on important developments related to water. It is with this objective that IWRA has encouraged the publication of a special issue of Water International on the topic of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, based on a special session held at the 15th World Water Congress in Edinburgh in 2015. The articles included in the special issue deal with the opportunities and challenges surrounding the GERD through multiple disciplinary lenses. They explore issues as the possibility of a new era of cooperation in the Eastern Nile Basin, the regional and global implications, and the benefits and possible drawbacks. In addition to this special issue, more articles on the topic of the GERD were published either in special issues of Water International or as an open submissions. Some of the authors are here part of this webinar, and I encourage you to check the Water International's website to find their papers. With such publications and by organizing webinars like this one, IWRA hopes to shed light on the GERD topic and to contribute to a better understanding of the issues at stake and generally to the more global topic of water and peace. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful and rich webinar and discussions with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Raya. Thanks for that introduction. Always a pleasure to have you. And now I'd like to pass the floor over to our moderator, Kevin Wheeler. Kevin, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this. I'm going to go ahead and kick off with a couple framing questions here, a little presentation. So water management in the Nile Basin has often been seen as one of the greatest natural resource challenges on Earth. In the 1900s, the development of the basin is focused on expanding agriculture, supplying cities, managing floods, generating hydropower. Today, effectively, all the water is used by the two downstream countries of Egypt and Sudan, even though about 85% is generated as rainfall in Ethiopia. According to Egypt's 2017 water resource plan, consumptive use there was about 630 cubic meters per capita, and they consider a level of absolute water security when it falls below 500. The prospect of Ethiopia and other countries developing their water resources upstream has been seen by an inherent right by these countries, but is seen as a threat from the perspective of Egypt. Now, in 2011, the construction began of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD, located on the Blue Nile, just about 15 kilometers upstream of the Sudanese border, and it's been the trigger for tensions. Although the GERD is considered to be non-consumptive use of water and has been built only for hydropower, significant concerns exist over its management and operations. Now, the process of filling the GERD began in about 2020. So there's our geography. just upstream of the border. So the process of filling began in about 2020 when Ethiopia conducted without the agreement of Egypt and Sudan. Many concerns were raised over the potential negative impacts of during the filling process. I myself studied this extensively, and like others, we concluded the risks were significant if a drought occurred simultaneously with the filling. After 4 flooding seasons, the GERD reservoir is nearly filled. Despite various forms of negotiations occurring since 2011, no agreement's been reached on how the dam will be operated or managed, particularly with respect to downstream needs and infrastructure. Now, the reservoir has reached about a level of 420 meters, which is only 5 meters shy of the level by which Ethiopia would consider the filling process complete. They've retained 42.5 billion cubic meters, and they only need to retain another 6.8 to reach the bottom of their flood pool, in which every year it'll go back to that level. Surely this will occur this year. Now, much to the surprise of many, the GERD reservoir filling process did not significantly impact the water supplies in Egypt. As you can see here, the storage of the High Aswan Dam in Egypt remains nearly full, almost at the top. So we can see that a combination of good hydrology and proper planning allowed Egypt to safely endure this period. Now, Sudan initially faced challenges, especially related to the prediction of the time when the GERD would reach its annual maximum and how Sudan would best operate their reservoirs immediately downstream. Now, I encourage people to look at this excellent article that was co-authored by one of our speakers here, Dr. Yasser, and how Sudan navigated that difficult period. Now begins a new era, a second new era, where both the GERD and the Aswan Dam are full, but essentially no agreements have been reached on how to manage for the long term, in particular in the face of drought. Now, the focus of this webinar is not to rehash the negotiations of the past or to assign blame on why they haven't succeeded. We want to look forward to understanding what the countries will do now as they're approaching a new normal situation. IWRA has gathered 4 world experts for this topic to discuss the Nile and the GERD. And I've asked these 2 questions. With the GERD reservoir now nearly filled and no agreements yet reached, what must the countries do to plan and prepare for a future drought, either collectively or individually? And how might the possibility of regional energy trade change the way the countries negotiate over management of the Nile? Now, let me introduce our speakers. We have 4 outstanding speakers here that are all very well versed in the topic of the Nile. Professor Yilmaz Salishi is a professor of water resource engineering at Addis Ababa University, with experiences on hydrologic and hydraulic studies and designs related to water supply, hydropower, irrigation, roads, development of water resource plans, including flood and drought management plans. He's authored with his colleagues more than 30 articles on water resource engineering and planning. Yilmaz has been a member of the International Panel of Experts for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, has been one of the lead tripartite negotiator teams for Ethiopia over the GERD. Second, Professor Mohammed Halal. Professor Halal is currently serving a 5-year term as a member of the African Union Commission on International Law, where he's the African Union Special Rapporteur on International Law and Cyberspace. His scholarship focuses on other areas among other areas, on rules regulating the use of armed force by states and legal aspects of international security affairs. I served as a lecturer for Harvard Law School and visiting professor at Ain Shams University in Egypt. From 2020 to 2021, Professor Halal served as a diplomat and as an international civil servant, including legal service as counsel for the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Egypt, advising on issues related to the African affairs and relations with the Nile Basin states. He's contributed many articles, many journal articles, many edited volumes, including an excellent article in Water International documenting from the Egyptian perspective the GERD negotiations during the so-called Washington process. Okay, and then Professor Yasser Mohammed is a civil engineer by training, specialized in hydrology and water resources. He's presently a professor of water resource engineering at IHE Delft in the Netherlands. He's been the joint appointee where he was professor of water resource management, general director at the Hydraulic Research Center until 2019 in Sudan. Now, after the Sudanese revolution of 2018 and 2019, Professor Yasser was appointed as the cabinet minister of irrigation and water resources for the transitional government of Sudan from 2019 to 2021, where he led the policy making and development for the water resource sector of Sudan. He made many achievements after the Sudanese revolution on ongoing strengthening the water institutions, departments, the Sudan water sector strategy, and leading the Sudan delegations in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And finally, we have Dr. Annalisa Cascal. She's an independent consultant and researcher on transboundary water politics. Dr. Cascal is an independent consultant and focuses on politics and diplomacy in the Nile and the MENA regions of Middle East, North Africa. She's worked and published extensively over the last 25 years on issues related to the changing politics and power dynamics in the Nile Basin, with a keen interest on the role of media shaping narratives in the basin. In 2016, she was the guest editor of a special issue for Water International titled The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Legal, Political, and Scientific Challenges. Now with that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Yilma for the first presentation for our four speakers. Professor Yilma.
I am honored to make a presentation in World Water Day webinar organized by International Water Resource Association on the topic which Kevin outlined already. So allow me to make a case to answer the question what the leading question Kevin outlined. In Ethiopia, the water resource basis, as you see on this map, the western part of Ethiopia is endowed of a very good amount of rainfall. But the eastern part of Ethiopia, as you clearly see, it's an arid area. So rainfall is from 200 to 600 millimeters per year. Basically, no crops grow there. So the western part means related to the Nile, that is the water resource base also of the Nile water. The Abai, Blue Nile, Tekeze, and Barakobo. Another issue for tropical Africa, tropical highland Africa, the rainfall is very seasonal. Only we have 3 to 4 months rainfall. The remaining months are dry. And when it falls in that 3 months, as any hydrologist could understand in arid area, I mean also in those highlands, from 75 to 85% are consumed by evapotranspiration, recharge. That means growing crops, rain-fed crops, vegetation, and so on. There is also additional phenomenon in this area, recurrent drought, caused mostly by El Nino. Every 5 to 10 years, it is inevitable we'll have a drought. So our rain-fed production system will basically fail in most part of Ethiopia, in the western part, even when we have a good rainfall. So this situation will lead to, to manage this drought situation, we need to have storage when the site is available, when the river flow is available. So overall, the water resource base of Ethiopia, in terms of the whole, 11 basins we have in Ethiopia, the Nile contributes basically 70% of its water resource of Ethiopia. On the land, the Nile system, as I mentioned, the Tekeze, Blue Nile, and Barakobo, they totally contribute 70% of Ethiopian river water resources. So there we have a stake. And also in terms of the land, irrigable land, more than 2.2 million hectares are in these basins of Ethiopia. That means when you compare to the remaining Ethiopian part, 63% of our resources there. And in terms of hydropower generation, our 64% of Ethiopian generation capacity is in the Nile part of Ethiopia. So this is a very strategic water resource for Ethiopia. Now, if you see it here, GERD is 15.7 terawatt hour per year, which is already developed in Blue Nile. So Having this in mind, the issue we have for Ethiopia, the resource base, the climate, forces which applied in our country, that in light of GERD now being nearly full, the question is what happened, under this situation. Of course, one thing is very clear. Our good friends, Honorable Professor Yasir and Mohammed Alal, we have been in this negotiation together. We know what we are talking about there. One thing is very clear. Drought is known at the end of September, if it occurs. We know how much water in the reservoir. So once we have that, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, water interest in drought period basically aligns. We don't have any contradiction. In drought period, because the reserve water in GERD is limited, Ethiopia also wants to generate more energy, and more water will go downstream to Sudan and Egypt. There is no issue there. Egypt and Sudan also, they will invoke their drought management rules. As we release more water from GERD, they also invoke their drought management. As the drought happens, the three countries will discuss in good faith on how to jointly mitigate drought year by year. So every year, if this drought comes, as we have been, the last 10 years been negotiating, we come together, how we manage our resources, including GERD, when drought happens. So this is what is now possible. But the critical issue comes at sea. We cannot have binding agreement because future release from GERD in drought and non-drought years cannot be put in legally binding rules because the future inflow into GERD depends on future hydrology and upstream of GERD water resource development in Ethiopia and risk of next year drought occurrence. It's a very complicated, 3 items are here. In particular, without clear allocation of water among the 3 countries or in the Nile Basin wide, Ethiopia cannot commit the amount of water release for next 15 years, what is coming out of GERD. And this is the major issue, why agreement not reached. But during drought, as I mentioned in B, we come together, we discuss together, we manage how to utilize our water resource, including the reserve water from GERD for the benefit of the 3 brotherly countries. In terms of regional energy trade, how this, change the negotiation over GERD or the Nile, I see it as follows. First, regional energy, fair trade. It has to be fair. There is no cheap energy. You can say maybe affordable energy. Market-based, it should be market-based. We cannot sell energy beyond the production of GERD. The GERD here, it's about 6 cents USD per kilowatt hour at the site, at the production. So that is a boundary. Although in Ethiopia, the government subsidizes electricity in the country, the populations here, it doesn't mean that is a reference. So it should be market-based, and it will create cooperation and build confidence among the countries. That is a sustainable way. Number 2, allows utilization of wind and solar energy to be integrated into the grid system because, GERD has each of the turbines are like 400 megawatts. They can just jump in a few minutes when wind and solar energy, going low. So that is a great advantage to integrate in this power trading system. So all this is possible in sustainable way, where when we consider the synergy and use of Nile water for water supply, hydropower, irrigation, other use must be accounted fairly in both upstream and downstream countries when dealing regional energy trade. What I mean is, Blue Nile water is not only for energy generation, because there are some group of people thought Ethiopia generate only hydropower in Blue Nile, sell that hydropower, that's the end of the story. It's not working like that. As I mentioned earlier, we want to generate, to develop irrigation, further develop irrigation, use for water supply industrial uses. So for that, water will be withdrawn upstream. Of course, GERD energy will reduce, we know that, but that will be the reality. Sustainable, rule-based regional energy trade will flourish, provided the Nile Basin countries enter water allocation action. I said water allocation repeated time. Egypt and Sudan recognize this. The water resource of the Nile is limited. Bilaterally, they went to water allocation. If water is abundant like Amazon or Mississippi, you may not need water allocation because it is abundant. Only quality is an issue. In the Nile, the issue of peace, sustainable peace will come, in my view, if we go the Nile Basin countries in water allocation agreement for all actions. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yilma. I appreciate that a lot. Professor Halal, if you could share your screen and share your perspectives, we would certainly appreciate that.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin, for the invitation, and thank you, IWRA, for the invitation. So I'm going to primarily address the first question that Kevin has asked, which is how should the three countries, the three co-riparians of the Blue Nile, cooperate in a situation of drought? And then I'm going to move on to the second question, although most of my presentation will be focused on the first question, which, as you may expect, is the question of principal importance for Egypt. So let me start off by underscoring what I'm sure everybody in the audience and all of my fellow panelists know, which is Egypt's vulnerabilities and Egypt's unique position from a hydrological perspective. 98% of Egypt's water resources emanate from outside its boundaries, and specifically 98% of the water that is available for the over 110 million Egyptians emanates from the Nile River. And as everyone knows—
Quick, Mohammed, your slides are not changing yet, just so you know. We're still looking at the first slide.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll work.
Yeah, so as everybody knows, Egypt is an incredibly vulnerable position from a hydrological perspective. The vast majority of Egypt's water resources that are absolutely essential for the survival of 110 million Egyptians emanate from outside its borders. And 98% of those water resources emanate from the Nile, and of course, the vast majority of the Nile's the water resources of the Nile emanate from Ethiopia. So Egypt is particularly vulnerable to any kind of alteration in the hydrological system of the Blue Nile in particular, but also any kind of alteration in the hydrological system in Ethiopia. There we go. Okay. So basically, the primary question that Kevin asked us to consider is the question of what should the three countries do in a situation of drought that may occur in the future? Well, luckily, international law provides us an answer, and that answer is through the application of the two cardinal principles that constitute the basic tenets of the the rules of international law that govern the utilization of international watercourses. And those two basic principles are the obligation not to cause significant harm, and second, the principle of the equitable and reasonable utilization of international watercourses. So how do these two principles apply in the context of a drought situation? Well, from my view, those two principles can be interpreted and can be applied in the context of a drought situation, and given the realities of the situation with the GERD, in the following way. First, if we have a drought situation, which may be a single-year drought or which may be a drought that would occur over several years, which we would call a long-term or extended drought, the first step is that there would be supplemental releases from the GERD that would be absolutely necessary to achieve two objectives. The first and foremost is to support the downstream states as they adapt to the ongoing drought situation and as they attempt to address the reduction in the annual yield of the Nile River. And second, to maximize and optimize the hydropower generation from the GERD. So that's the first step that needs to be taken in a drought situation, which is to undertake supplemental releases from the GERD. And as I said, they would achieve two objectives, and they would satisfy the interests of both the upstream state and the downstream states. They would ensure optimal generation of hydropower for the GERD, but also ensure that Egypt and Sudan are provided with the necessary water resources to address and mitigate the effects of an ongoing drought. And as I noted, this applies whether we're talking about a single year drought, which is any year where we have an annual yield that is below the historical average, which is around 49 billion cubic meters per year, or if we have an extended drought, which is several years where we have below average flows in the Blue Nile. So that would be the first step. The second step is that we need to understand there has to be a cooperative refilling strategy. And this is an element that is often overlooked by scholars and also by policymakers active in this field. Particularly for Egypt, the refilling strategy, which applies after the end of the drought, is an incredibly important element of any drought mitigation scheme. Specifically, these are the rules that apply to refill the reservoirs of the main hydropower facilities in the area, which of course include the High Aswan Dam and the GERD. The reason this is important is because after a drought has ended and after the Blue Nile returns to average or above average flows, the resilience of the High Aswan Dam will be depleted, which means that Egypt will be in an especially vulnerable position to any possible fluctuations in the system. So it's absolutely essential to any drought mitigation scheme that may be adopted by the three countries to ensure that there is a robust refilling strategy that ensures that resilience of the High Aswan Dam is recovered quickly, while also ensuring that the GERD continues to generate hydropower with at optimal levels. Third, and this is absolutely essential, and I take note of what my dear brother Atto Yelma mentioned. Any new upstream projects that may be undertaken by Ethiopia and which will invariably and inevitably affect the functioning of the entire Blue Nile system have to be undertaken with and within the framework of a legally binding agreement. That is absolutely essential. The reason is very simple. Egypt cannot allow itself to be held hostage to a year-by-year negotiation with Ethiopia and Sudan. That does not provide any predictability, does not provide any guarantee of security for a downstream state. You have to put yourselves in Egypt's shoes. Essentially, what would happen is that if we enter into a sequence of drought, if we enter into a sequence of below average years, essentially what my dear colleague and my dear brother, Professor Yilma, is suggesting is that Egypt would have to enter into a year-by-year annual negotiation in which it would request Ethiopia to release extra volumes of water from its hydropower facilities, whether the GERD or any future projects that it's planning. And from a political and legal perspective, that's simply untenable. It would be impossible for Egypt to plan and to be able to engage in mitigation strategies without having an established drought mitigation mechanism that is codified in a legally binding agreement that provides predictability and a sense of guarantee and assurance. So one of the lessons learned that we have from the GERD negotiations is that we simply cannot proceed and we cannot go forward with any new projects upstream of the GERD without a legally binding agreement. Fourth, if we engage, let's assume that Ethiopia plans a new project, because in absolute honesty, as Kevin mentioned earlier, the GERD is pretty much fully filled, and we have entered the operation stage. The principal concern for Egypt, in addition to the question of drought mitigation, is what happens after the GERD. And we all know, it's not a secret, everyone knows that Ethiopia is planning future projects upstream of the GERD. And that is a principal concern for Egypt. And from our perspective, one of the principal rules of international law, which is the obligation not to cause significant harm, requires the upstream state not to implement any new future upstream projects during drought conditions. As the very first slide that Kevin showed, and it showed how the High Aswan Dam managed to preserve a large degree, but not complete, but a large degree of its resilience, is because Egypt managed to engage in very good hydrological planning during this period in order to absorb the impact of the GERD. Imagine the situation where we'd have a new project upstream of the GERD that would be undertaken and constructed and filled during drought conditions. That is a situation that we believe would be very detrimental to Egypt's interests. Fifth and finally, no new upstream projects should be undertaken until systemic resilience is restored. And systemic resilience obviously means that the principal downstream hydropower facility, which is the High Aswan Dam, would have sufficient resilience to be able to absorb and adapt to any changes upstream of the GERD. So to me, those are the 5 main principles of the 5 main applications of the 2 cardinal principles of international law, which are the obligation not to cause significant harm and the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. So someone might ask, what does a drought mitigation mechanism look like? What are the basic components of a drought mitigation mechanism? Well, ultimately, a drought mitigation mechanism includes 2 principal components. First, we need to agree on a definition of drought, and the purpose of that definition is that it establishes the trigger at which point the mitigation measures begin to be implemented. And the definition of drought could be defined using multiple methods. First, we can define a drought on the basis of a deviation from the historical average, right? There's a historical series, there are a set of realities about the Blue Nile, and we all have pretty much the same data, and the scientific community has the same data. We know what the current historical average of the Blue Nile is. So one approach for defining a drought is to measure it on the basis of deviations from the historical average. Another possible method of defining a drought is by measuring the annual releases from the GERD. So basically, we would measure how much water is being released from the GERD, and if the amount of the volume of water that is being released from the GERD is below a certain threshold, that would be the trigger. Another possible trigger that would, at which point the mitigation measures would be applied, is reservoir levels throughout the system, which include the GERD and the High Aswan Dam. That would actually be a very effective approach to defining a drought and applying a mitigation measure, because we would apply a multi-reservoir operation, which would be a symbol of cooperation between the 3 countries. So those are just 3 examples of methods by which we can define a drought. Now, what are the mitigation measures? Well, obviously, the mitigation measures that would be triggered if we enter into a drought situation would be that the upstream state would undertake extra or supplemental releases, and then we would have drawdowns or reduced consumption by the downstream states. And also, very importantly, there would be a cooperative refilling strategy for the post-drought situation or the post-drought stage in order to restore resilience in the system. So these are just multiple options and multiple pathways to designing and establishing a drought mitigation mechanism. And ultimately, such a mechanism has to be embedded in a legally binding instrument to ensure that the rights and obligations of all parties are protected and preserved. So let me give you just an example of how such a drought mitigation mechanism would apply. This is the historical average of the Blue Nile. As you can see here, the middle line, or the center line, is basically the center axis on this graph is basically the average. And you can see years where we have wet conditions, which is above average hydrology. And then we have dry conditions, which here is simulated. This is similar to the famous long-term extended drought of the 1980s, where you see several years of below average hydrology, and then you have average conditions. Basically, what we would have in a drought mitigation mechanism based on the cumulative deviation from the average is that we would agree that every time there is a deviation from the historical average of the Blue Nile, which everyone agrees is around 49 billion cubic meters, that would trigger the drought mitigation mechanism. And that would that would basically the countries would be obligated at that point to take some adaptation measures to address the drought conditions. If it's a 1-year drought, probably the mitigation measures would be very minimal. But if it's a long-term drought, which is the more serious situation, that is when we would need to have a robust measures such as the ones I outlined, where we'd have significant supplemental releases from upstream reservoirs and also reduced consumption from downstream states. Here's another example, and this is my final slide. As you can see, this is another example of a drought mitigation scheme. This is the drought mitigation scheme that is established between Egypt and Sudan. So as you can see, the threshold or the trigger for the drought mitigation mechanism is a certain level in the High Aswan Dam, which is at 160 meters above sea level. So if the High Aswan Dam hits a level of 160 meters, that is when Egypt and Sudan begin to implement a jointly agreed drought mitigation measure. And as you can see, this mechanism or this agreement was reached in 1984. Between the two countries, and was implemented during the long-term drought of the 1980s. Again, this is a mechanism that can very well be replicated between the three countries. We can have specific thresholds and triggers for the drought mitigation mechanism that are based on water levels in the High Aswan Dam and the GERD, or in other projects that may be undertaken by Ethiopia. But ultimately, the purpose is to have a cooperative mechanism that has clearly defined thresholds and clearly defined measures that would be undertaken cooperatively by the three countries. But the notion that basically Egypt and Sudan, or Egypt specifically, would have to go to Ethiopia every hydrological year. So basically every September, go to Ethiopia and basically ask for supplemental releases that would be negotiated on a year-by-year level. That's actually not a tenable situation. It's also inconsistent with international law, which requires states to agree on mechanisms to prevent the infliction of significant harm. So again, this is another example. I'm sure this drought mitigation measure agreed between Egypt and Sudan can very easily be adapted to incorporate Ethiopia, and to alter the triggers to incorporate the GERD or other projects, and also to alter the measures to be executed by the downstream states. So the short of it is the following. There are multiple hydrological solutions. There are multiple technical solutions. There are many options out there that can be adopted by the three states in order to address a future drought situation. The science is there. The engineering solutions are available. What is lacking is political will. That, to me at least, is the principal lesson of the GERD negotiations. Any future drought situation, in order to ensure that the three countries are able to cooperate to address the situation, will need to be undertaken through agreeing on a comprehensive agreement on managing the GERD and any other projects upstream thereof. Thank you, Kevin.
Very much, Professor Halal, for that. We're a little bit over time. We had a 10-minute question session that we kind of went through. But I think it was really important to give the time for that explanation, and as well as with Dr. Yilma. I'll ask one question before we start out with the next one, and it's sort of a little bit more in depth to one of the questions that was posted online. And this is directed towards Dr. Yilma, and he replied, but I'd like to get a little bit more. So the question was: numerous studies intentionally misinform the public about GERD issues, including structural safety and construction of the reservoir and saddle dams, and undermines trust among the countries, and asks what scholarly measures can be taken to mitigate the problem. Now, you posted online that the GERD is designed and constructed professional ways, following the international standards and checked by the IPOE. But the IPOE, that was back in 2012, 2013. And what I'm wondering is there a need and a responsibility to have verification? I agree with you, and I've been to the dam site a couple times now, and I've had the opportunity to see the construction works there. But obviously, it's a very complex project, and it's the quality assurance, quality control is a continuous thing, and it seems like it would behoove Ethiopia to show the quality of the dam. And so I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on what you think Ethiopia might do moving forward to not just rely on the standards, but how to display how that the quality of the dam, so it alleviates those concerns.
Thank you, Kevin. In a very unique way, we opened our dam site from even foundation level and to its full design for scrutiny by international bodies, including IPOE. So that part at the initial phase has been concluded. It was very clear. Now, the practice, you see, is not there at all. You later on, when the dam is going to finish, come and check the safety of, what about is a failure, the fear is a failure. What about Hayaswanda? How many years old? I mean, doesn't the Egyptian people fear of Hayaswanda? It's old technology. We rely on engineering solution. Ethiopia is not building a dam to fail. This is very obvious. There is no reason to do that. And the supervising consultant and the contractor are world renowned. They built hundreds of dams all over the world. So, such questions are like political questions, just to create havoc in downstream countries, to instigate fear, in particular to Sudanese population. It's not the case. So one of course, the critical issue in dam to worry is about earthquake. The dam site is not earthquake prone. So that is, by nature, that is really solved. If you build a highly earthquake prone area, your dam, then the chance of failure is very high. So I think there is no need to, in my view, to open again about the dam safety. If that happens, then, all countries dam safety. It is like by procedure. It's not because we are Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Everywhere in the world, because now, this is an international discussion. We go into to scrutinize very old dams. What happened to them? Then that is my response, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and dams around the world have to be looked at multiple times. The Hoover Dam, the Glen Canyon Dam, there's always concerns about if the spillways are used. So it's not a unique problem to that, but it is a common problem of continuous monitoring and evaluation. So we're going to jump onto the next set of presentations, and we'll have some more time for some questions and answers later. So the next presentation is from Professor Yasser Mohammed, and if he could show his screen, and we'll let him talk from the Sudanese perspective, that would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for International Water Resources Association. I will give my perspective. It is not the formal position of the Sudan government. It is my own opinion as a researcher in the Nile Basin. And the title of my talk will be about the GERD from a potential threat to a potential opportunity. And I will focus on 3-4 points to answer the 2 questions. That the basin needs to be inclusive, and prolonged drought is a rare event. I will show a hydrograph on that. And thanks to the 2 mega dams, the GERD and HAD, I will prove why. And what will be the future is through enlarging the cake. What you see now is just a schematization of the dam systems. The GERD is 10 times bigger than Roseris, very close, and it is half of the HAD, the High Osman Dam. The 2 questions of the webinar is how to prepare for a future drought and how the energy trades will affect the negotiations. It seems these 2 questions were focusing on upstream Ethiopia and downstream Egypt and ignoring the midstream Sudan. Why? Because of the dam safety issue for Roseris, very close to the GERD, with very long earth embankments on both sides at a very, very high risk if there is no data exchange on how to operate reservoirs. So any failure of reservoirs, it means that the damage for whole of Central Sudan. And we remember this event during the first year of filling, July 2020, when there was a sudden closure of the culvert of the GERD, resulting in a sudden drop of the Blue Nile, when the drinking water supply in some areas in Khartoum was in shortage for a couple of days. And that was a big blow in the newspapers. And I remember we were in office and that was huge pressure on our shoulders. And so far the Sudanese tried to use satellite data to minimize risk and operate resource reservoir, but that's not optimal. So the risk is there with no data exchange. So the key message from this slide is that dam safety for resource reservoir and exchange of data between the GERD and resource is really crucial for the midstream part of the basin. Here, what you see is a 100 years record of the Blue Nile at the border, the annual flow. And what I'm trying to say here is that the prolonged drought is very rare. It occurs in the mid-80s, which is once in 100 years. And even that has very minimal impact on hydropower generation from the GERD and from the HUD. I will show you from computer simulation. So if we start filling the GERD for different time periods, for example, if we start filling it during the average years, we say from 1988 to 1997, that is the average window. Or if we fill it during the prolonged drought period from 1979 to 1987, and we do that with different scenarios. And here we assume the GERD is completely empty. I mean, like original, the initial filling. Now the GERD will have some kind of storage. But this is very conservative scenarios. And for example, scenario A, you release 60% of the flow and you store 40%. Scenario B, you store half and you release half. What we will see, how many years the GERD will get full. If it is average sequence of years, the GERD can get full in 4 years or 3 years or 3 years. If it is, for example, it gets full in 3 years if it is half storage. If it is a sequence of dry years, it takes longer because the Blue Nile is bringing little water. So if you release 60% of the water, you may need 7 years to fill the GERD. But what is important here is that even with these different filling years, the impact on hydropower generation is really small, it's really minimal. You see different scenarios of hydropower generations in gigawatt hour per year for the average scenarios and for the dry scenarios and for different filling areas. The message here is that because of the high storage of the GERD, filling in different years has minimal impact on power generations. The same thing, we saw it from the computer results for the High Aswan Dam. That is why I mentioned thanks to the size of those two mega dams, because they have very long residence time. The memory is very long, so they can absorb this prolonged drought. Now, what happened during this initial filling? This is a Aswan High Aswan Dam water level measurements, and this is from satellite. What you see the last 4 years is also very high levels. Not only that, but if you zoom in, this is the evapotranspiration map from WAPUR dataset. It shows the water consumption from vegetation cover all over the Nile. And if you zoom into close to the Aswan, to the high dam, and you see there is new irrigation development. This is 2019, this pivot system, and this is 2023. And that is thanks to the hydrology of the Blue Nile, too much water came, but also thanks to more conservative planning from Aswan, from High Aswan Dam, so that they could maintain high level and also develop new irrigation system. And my slide here is what will be the future perspectives. And I think most important is to depoliticize the GERD. We know that the countries have agreed almost 90% on the technical issues. They had some issues with the legal part. How to depoliticize is very much concerning the normal person in Addis or in Khartoum or in Cairo by enlarging the cake for the people in those countries. How to enlarge the cake? By enhancing cooperation beyond the water, like food, for not only energy, for example, food security is very crucial. Trade, cross-border trade, transport among the countries, movement of people, protection of environment. These are very crucial for the region stability of the region. And international law is also very crucial, and to build on what has already achieved in the basin, starting from 1902 agreement, 1959 agreement, and 2015, the Declaration of Principles. Also, these are very good base from the legal side to look into the future with more cooperation beyond the water. And I like to show this example, comparing the Nile, the Eastern Nile and the Rhine. I mean, there is a lot of similarity in hydrology and so on. But if you see the cooperation, 200 billion euro is the cross-border trade between the Netherlands and Germany. How much is the cross-border trade between Sudan and Ethiopia or Sudan and Egypt? I would expect it's less than 1 billion. There is 300 million tons of wood transported by ship crossing the German border to the Netherlands. So this kind of interdependencies of which purely for the benefit of the people is what we miss in the Nile. Senegal rivers are also much more advanced on cooperation compared to the Nile. Niger River, similarly. This is my last slide. I borrowed from my colleague, Dr. Belleta. He was heading the Ethiopian delegates during these GERD negotiations. In 2018, he said, the more cooperative we are, the more valuable we become. The more adaptive we are, the more productive we become. And I think it is time to change the words into action. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Yasser, Professor Yasser. Yeah, you've been very involved in these issues, and you're at the forefront for Sudan for several years on this. So appreciate you being engaged. So we'll next turn over to Dr. Anna Cascow for some of her perspectives, looking across the different scenarios, and she comes from a more of a political background, understanding the relations between the countries.
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be part of it. I mean, for me, it's an honor to be with former negotiators and people that are still influencing the process. I mean, obviously, I'm not a former negotiator because I'm not even from any of these countries. And I'm not an associate professor as the three other guests. So I guess that my legitimacy to talk about the issue is a bit less, and not a technical or legal expert. So basically, I suppose that I was invited because I've been 20 years looking at the politics of this river and everything that is surrounding, and in particular 13 of which on the GERD. Well, and to arrive to a very simple conclusion after all these years, that there is not such a thing as hydropolitics or negotiations on water, because the negotiations on the GERD, or even before that, is politics and geopolitics. And I think it was already mentioned here by by the three guests, actually, that a lot is related to political will. So there is no lack of technical solutions. I think that's a consensus about it. I suppose that the legal codification of what could be those legal solutions are mainly on details, or so I understand that. So it remains the politics, internal politics, and I would say the moment we are living now in the world, and not just in the Nile region, I mean, it's quite critical. And to be honest, I'm not totally sure that we are doing the favor talking about water, peace, and security when we are living the moment that we are. And I mean, I picked on the words from Raya at the beginning, is that there is a sea of change just next door to Egypt, by the way, in Gaza, where people are dying or thirst or dehydration, which means that there is no water. I mean, not to say that there is nil resources arriving there. But I mean, this is just like a historical factor, but perhaps it's coming very in hand for the debates about how to manage a dam that is already filled, which I suppose is the case of the GERD. Is that in the 70s, when Egypt was negotiating the peace agreement with Israel, so very similar situation we have now, a very unstable region, there was a promise in the agreement of the Al Salam Canal, which could bring some water to the Sinai and later on. I mean, this was promised out of political negotiations, but because the Haswanai Dam was full, right? So there is always possibilities, if I understood correctly, if there is water enough for all the users. So the problem then is the droughts, but how do you arrive to negotiate those issues when there is no drought? And I think there was, I mean, a mention, if we would be talking about this 5 years ago, I said, oh, there might be a drought during the filling, but now there was no drought during the filling, so it's not a problem anymore, and it's the future that is the problem, correct? And I mean, just to say that is in moments like this, like the ones we live around the world, that sometimes the unthinkable happens. But I mean, just moving to the Nile region, which I think it's very problematic, and I find it, I mean, really strange that nobody mentioned, but that the GERD could even consider be a non-priority right now for the three countries. And I start with Sudan, which I think it's the most critical case. I mean, we know there is a war going on since April 2023, and displacement of millions of people, and that will have impacts, of course, in the availability of food and water, but that people are moving from the Nile regions or from one Nile regions towards the other. And I would like Yasser, if he has the opportunities, to say how farming in the Nile banks, in the Blue Nile banks, have actually declined substantially since the war has started. And my second question would be, who is operating the dams in Sudan? We are talking about the coordination in the future, knowing that the war might not finish so soon. So who is going to be responsible? Or even the question now, who has legitimacy from the Sudanese side to negotiate or even sign an agreement? I mean, is there a government in Sudan to do so? And I mean, what would be the consequences of signing an agreement? I mean, would that be binding? I mean, for the international lawyer here, I mean, who has the responsibility or the legitimacy to sign an agreement? So I would say for Sudan, just being very brief, I have a sentence for each country that the Nile is definitely not a priority right now, March 2023. I mean, for Ethiopia, the way I read the situation, and in particular since the change of regime in Ethiopia, but in particular since November 2020, when the Tigray war has started, and I would like to remember the Tigray region is not in the Blue Nile, but is in another tributary of the Nile, which is the Tekeze, which contributes a substantial amount to the Nile as well. So by focusing always in the Blue Nile and the future projects in the Blue Nile, we might once again be missing the picture. But right now, talking about future projects in the Nile, which I think it's the major concern, of course, of Egypt and partially to Sudan, is the question if the Ethiopian government has the, I would not even say capacity, but the will. I mean, I would say, and I apologize for the Ethiopians in this room or in this audience, that the Nile is a sideshow in what is going on right now. The investments are going to wind and solar. This brings me to the regional market energy. The large-scale agriculture is in other regions of Ethiopia. I mean, this finance is coming, direct investment from other places, and one would wonder that an economy, a war economy right now, would be able to launch a large-scale dam in the Blue Nile. I mean, depends on how we look at it, because one thing is to say, I will build a dam, and the other thing is to say, I will start building a dam. In any case, Egypt, of course, should be concerned, and I hope that there is diplomatic avenues to even consider that. I mean, beyond the discussion about the water allocations that might need to be renegotiated if there is a binding agreement, as Ilma was suggesting. So my question, I mean, regarding Ethiopia, I think Ethiopia has other major political and geopolitical issues right now, namely the access to a port in the Red Sea that, as we know, is another complex region. So right now, Ethiopia is concerned about having access to the sea, and Egypt having issues with the Red Sea for the revenue. So, and moving to Egypt, I would say that the Nile right now is an afterthought. I mean, there is much more major concerns. Of course, we know that for Egypt, the Nile will be a major political and geopolitical concern forever, right? I mean, but in a way, the GERD is history in the sense that it's being filled. I understand there must be something in place then to, I mean, manage the water releases and, I mean, vis-a-vis of course, the hydropower potential and all the financial resources that will come with it. But I mean, just listening quite quickly what in the last 2 or 3 years concerns, or sorry, in particular in the last year concerns Egypt, is an economic meltdown. And I mean, the revenues from the Suez Canal that have decreased like 50% ever since the 7th of October, the influx of people from Sudan and most likely from Gaza soon. So that means that Egypt will have a bigger pressure, politically speaking, internally, including water resources available. But what has the GERD to do with it? I'm talking about decisions to be taken now and the importance that the issues have now. And at the same time, and then I jump for the regional markets, the regional energy markets. I mean, while the GERD negotiations were going on, and I'm not going to get into the GERD negotiations because obviously I'm not the one to do that, Egypt was signing, negotiating big agreements on gas and to the Mediterranean in between. So what are the value we are giving now for the regional markets? Are we talking about what exactly? I mean, the hydropower mixing with other sources of energy, for whom to buy? I mean, if we are talking about the large scale, are still going back to the past when there was this idea that would be agreed with Egypt, and therefore this grid would go everywhere around Europe and the Middle East? Are we talking about something related to the Gulf, but does the Gulf need more energy, or Africa? And in that case, would beg the question, who is going to finance that? And I mean, Ethiopia with the GERD and the Mandaya and whatever Bekoab and whatever dams will come next and might increase the amount of energy in the system or that Ethiopia can export, who is going to buy that? And I mean, what is there in place and how is that related to the, I mean, the operations of the dam? So I have more questions than to answer, than any kind of answers. But I mean, this to say that looking at the current political landscape in the region, which is very critical, I would like to understand, I mean, where do these conversations fit? Because if it's this idea, if the security situation, the geopolitical security situation of the region has an impact on these negotiations, make it easier, or the other way around. The fact that there is so much insecurity will downplay the issue of the dam or of the Nile to an extent that maybe there is a radical moment that the countries will come and talk about an agreement binding or not. And what is that? 1 year of drought? 2 years of drought? What is exactly the tipping point that the countries would imagine that this would take over? I think I didn't spend my 8 minutes, right? So I think
you're good. You're good.
Okay, so in that case, I think I said everything I'd said. So let's zoom out instead of just zooming in and having our own definition of peace for the Nile, because I mean, we are not living in a peaceful world and the region is not living in a peaceful world. So in a way, yes, it's important to avoid conflicts in the future, but addressing the ones that have now. If nothing else, for the teams that are negotiating that have legitimacy to do so, I mean, that these countries give the power to the experts, technical experts, plus the legal experts, and plus the political diplomats and of all different stages that are able to negotiate an agreement that actually satisfies all the needs. Do we need to arrive to the point, the breaking point, that actually it's going to be problematic for Sudan, first of all, because of the floods, for Egypt at a later stage, and for Ethiopia that might lose revenues that are so much needed for the economy right now and in the near future? Okay, Kevin. you can take over.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's any question of why we invited Anna, I think everybody knows right now. She brings a great perspective, wider than just our water focus here. I think it was really good points that she brought up that I think we want to look at a little bit, particularly for our second question of hydropower sales and how that might change things. Now, the GERD sits immediately above the border with Sudan, and when I was there, they were constructing a 500 kilovolt line directly into Sudan. With the idea that they're going to sell a lot of electricity to Sudan. There's a little bit of sales right now, but the instability in Sudan certainly has changed that landscape. So one question, maybe for Dr. Yilma, Professor Yilma, is how critical are those power sales for the GERD, or for Ethiopia, for the GERD? And there's a new Tanzania agreement. These are all fairly small amounts, but the regional stability of Sudan must be a critical factor if power sales are going to be a driving factor for this, as has been presumed for many years. So first off, maybe if Dr. Salishi could respond to that, and then we'll continue on with this about Sudan with the others.
Thank you, Kevin. GERD, when in a power selling mode, for example, if you sell 200 megawatt, it means it's a continuous 200 megawatt. So the continuous megawatt from GERD we can sell is about 2,000 megawatt to use the whole water, the average water we have. So basically, with Kenya 200 taking, Djibouti also about 100 megawatts. The Kenya expansion is coming. Half of it is going to be exported in a continuous basis, 24 hours basis. The remaining, we in Addis and in many towns, we have a number of industries waiting for connection. The power demand from Ethiopian Electric Power, if you see their report, it will be absorbed in our system. So there is no worry that the need, for selling hydropower for the sake of generating electricity, it's not in that direction. But the government direction is, from what I understand, it is a cooperative basis to link up with our neighbors for cooperation and good brotherhood. So, economic linkage, as you also mentioned, is a very important. It will avoid you many, later on political issues. So we do not foresee a challenge in that direction. So, thank you.
To Professor Yasser, and obviously the difficult situation in Sudan. First off, we'd like to know if you have knowledge of how the hydropower there is functioning. It must be amazing work that the staff are there at the dams managing things. And what do you areas so they're not destroyed during the war, or will there have to be a massive rebuilding effort to get the infrastructure back in place for Sudan at the end of this war?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's indeed challenging to operate 6 dams in a situation of a war. I mean, it's really hard, but I'm really impressed by. I'm not working with the team because I'm outside the government now, but I'm really impressed by the dedication and the commitment of the technical staff, how they operate the dams using WhatsApp meetings. I mean, Roseris is this level, Marawi is this level. Can we release that? And someone doing some simple computation. So they are really impressive to maintain dam operation during this harsh time. Even one time I remember the lady director of dams operation, she said, while she's texting, she's hearing the bullets above her head. It was really impressive. So I think in that, let me be very proud of those people responsible for dam operations. but the risk is there. I mean, we should not underestimate the risk. For example, Jabal Aulia Dam is not, there is no one is there. So there is huge risk there. For research, for example, I mean, when there is no exchange of data or information from the GERD to research, it's still huge risk about the safety of research itself. So let us pray that at least no disaster or no something serious happen during this hard time of Sudan. I'm sure the war will stop, and Sudan will come again into peace and fair and look into the future to cooperate with two neighbors from Ethiopia and from Egypt. But I would like to extend the discussion beyond hydropower, because that's the potential. I mean, hydropower is a small angle of the GERD. If we see the food security, it's much bigger kind of opportunity in the basin, having like 250 or 300 million people. I mean, why we import from Ukraine or from Colorado? Why not to import from Ethiopia or from Sudan or from Egypt? I see these interdependencies which will resolve the GERD issue, not the drought, not the power trade. I mean, it is the normal person in Sudan or in Ethiopia or in Egypt, how would see the benefit from the GERD? How that to me is the most important, and which will pave the way for reaching consensus among the three countries.
Thank you, Dr. Yasser. And that brings up an extremely important point that a lot of us understand in the basin, that I have to communicate to my Egyptian colleagues that the amount of water consumption in Ethiopia, obviously Dr. Yilma is involved in that as well, but wondering how much they would potentially develop. But Sudan has the ability to divert a lot more water. Physically, they could. The GERD is going to provide a much steadier flow of water through the Blue Nile and would allow Sudan to potentially develop more. Now, that of course is not something that that Egypt might be concerned about. It's something Egypt might be concerned about, utilizing additional water resources for development in Egypt. So I'm going to Professor Halal comment a little bit about the relationship with the 1959 agreement and what Professor Mohammed or Professor Yasser said about the potential changes in or augmentation of food growth or development for food resources. So if you have any thoughts on the 1959 agreement in particular and how that does constrain things from changing within the basin.
No, the short answer to your question, Kevin, is that the 1959 agreement is irrelevant to the discussion on the GERD. 1959 is a bilateral agreement between Egypt and Sudan. It is not part of the conversation that we're having on the GERD. Rather, the question of the GERD is how are we going to complete the filling, but more importantly, the operation of this major hydropower facility. And as we think of the operation of the GERD, the question is, there are 30 billion cubic meters of water that are the live storage of the GERD. The question is, in relation to long-term operation, how was that quantity of water going to be used in the future in a situation of drought? And I'm sure this is the priority for Sudan, how is that volume of water going to be used on a day-by-day basis, on a week-by-week basis? What is the daily variation in the releases of the GERD? These are questions that remain unanswered. So maybe contrary to what my good friend Anna was mentioning, the GERD is a priority, and the Nile remains the principal national security concern for Egypt, regardless of whether we have or have not reached an agreement on the GERD. And the problem with the experience we had with the GERD is that it makes Egypt especially worried about the future. It makes Egypt especially worried about future projects, because we know Ethiopia is planning to undertake further hydropower facilities upstream of the GERD, and Ethiopia is planning further consumptive uses. So the problem really relates to the fact that, as my dear brother, my dear friend, Dr. Saleshi mentioned, that Ethiopia is not willing to enter into a legally binding agreement, and that Ethiopia insists on negotiating year by year on any future drought situation. So it's impossible to think of and plan about food security. It's impossible to plan and to think about hydropower trade if we don't even have the basic foundation, which is a legally binding agreement that would be necessary to understand how the GERD is going to operate. Now imagine the complexity of the situation when we add another dam to the system, when we add, let's just call it Upper Mandaya, a hypothetical dam. When we introduce that dam into the system, what's going to be the situation then? It's very difficult to hypothesize about food security and consumptions in Sudan when those very basic building blocks, we don't know, we have no predictability about how Ethiopia is going to behave. And in the absence of an agreement, and with our Ethiopian colleagues saying we have to negotiate year by year, that just doesn't provide the foundation of confidence that would be necessary to, as His Excellency, the former minister mentioned, to broaden the pie. It's very difficult to have that conversation in the absence of that basic building block.
And I think that I understand that the legally binding aspect is a very pivotal point for Egypt. And I think it's important to also get a good understanding of what the frequency of these droughts are. These are potentially pretty rare droughts. And at what point does that assistance need to happen? So Professor Halal talked about a trigger, and that's obviously been what triggers one would use. Now, maybe going back to well, we only have one more minute in this, so let's see. Let's go with one more question for Dr. Yilma here. So so Professor Halal said something very important that the deviation, he talked about the cumulative deficit approach, and that really focuses on a deviation from the average. And obviously that's been something that's been a challenge for Ethiopia to accept, because that would forego their possibility of utilizing water in the future. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that another type of agreement couldn't be reached and couldn't be potentially binding that would evacuate water from the reservoirs that's not fixed to a certain volume. So I'm curious from Dr. Yilma if the avoidance of a binding agreement is strictly tied to a number, or does Ethiopia want to avoid any kind of binding agreement on anything at all with this?
Yeah. You know, drought measured from average, committing to that means, you know, it's average is a number. It's 49, let's say 49 BCM. You agree to water allocation. In another word, you know, my brother Hilal said, don't talk about water allocation, don't talk about 1959 agreement. What we're saying is very clear. Until we get water sharing and water allocation agreement, when drought comes, we come together as 3 countries to utilize the stored water. I have not said forever we come together every 3-4 years. I have not said that. Until we get water allocation agreement. In fact, in many countries, including USA, the upstream countries will not request the downstream countries for water allocation. We constrain ourselves. By water allocation means our share is known, we constrain, will be binded by that allocation. Although the water is in our territory, we are not free to utilize it. Only the amount allocated for us. I mean, it may vary from year to year depending on hydrology. So this is what we are demanding. It's a fair request. If you see that, Professor Hilal said, from now on, no upstream development until we have country, forego their upstream development. So that is really a very critical issue. It is not about drought. Drought is a coined word for, in a meticulous way to pass the water allocation issue. In the last 10 years, every expert knows this. So it has to be, the clear direction is for the 3 countries to go for water allocation. I mean, it has to be very clear, Kevin.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we are just out of time right now. And so quickly wrapping up, I think we've had excellent conversation, good perspectives. This is a topic that we could go on for many, many hours discussing. But I want to thank everybody first. I think we had really good perspectives. We're moving in, the Nile's moving into a new era right now where the filling is not the concern. And it's would be unfortunate if this fell to the back burner of everybody's plate and waited until there was a drought. When a drought comes, these will be very difficult discussions to have. So I think we all would agree that these things need to keep going on. It needs to be pulled off of the back burner to the front burner prior to a critical situation. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Lindsay to go ahead and close off the session.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I just wanted to say thank you to each of our speakers for joining us and this very important topic. Thank you so much for giving your time and for having such a great conversation. To those in the audience, we had up to, I think, even 250 plus attending this conversations with a very, very active Q&A and chat box. So thank you, audience, for tuning in to this important discussion. I think having this conversation on approaching World Water Day is just so timely. So thank you all for participating, for engaging in conversations. And I'd just like to say thank you. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please follow us on IWRA's LinkedIn site to follow the chat. In the next few days, many of you guys asked about presentations from our speakers, as well as the recording that will be posted on IWRA's website. I've included a link of where you can find that. It is at iwra.org/webinars. Again, our presentations and the webinar recording, as well as a summary of this discussion, will be posted there. If you'd like to become a member, there's also a link in the chat where you can find more information and get more involved in the association. And on behalf of IWRA, thank you again for tuning into this webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.